We have this whole myth of our country as being this barren wasteland. Oh, it's full of desert and it's all fucked. It's so hard and awful to live in and we just got to tough it out. But that's not how it needs to be at all. Indigenous people lived for 40 or 50,000 years, maybe more, on this continent, and they did fine. They were here. They were doing it because they had developed ways to exist within this climate.
He's such a good boy.
About a month ago, I decided to do an experiment because my spinach wasn't growing and I wasn't happy with how it was growing. So I thought, all right, I got to test to see what's wrong with it. I want to try a bunch of different growing conditions and see if I can get some spinach to grow. I got a couple of these planter trays here, right? So they got 10 cells in each. I filled one with potting mix and the other one with soil from the garden. And then I planted some seedlings from Bunnings, one in each of the cells in one row. And then in the other row, I put seeds. So I got 5 seedlings, 5 seeds. And in the other one, same thing. 2 different types of soil. And then in every column, I put different amounts of fertilizer once a week. So in number 1, just water. Number 2, I put 1 drop of fertilizer once a week. Number 3, I put a pipette full. Number 4, I put half a little cap full, so like 15 mil. And in number 5, I put a full cap. And I did that once a week for a month in both. And the idea was to test what conditions, what amounts of fertilizer, blah, 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 were best for growing spinach. Because I thought surely something has to work. I don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work. I feel like everything I do, my spinach just kept dying. So let me just try everything, throw something at the wall and just see what sticks, right? But then I thought, how's the video going to be funny? And I'm going to fucking take the camera inside. Then I had, okay, the second part of the idea is I want to have another plant inside out of the elements. And there it is. There's my other little plant. It's a spinach plant. I've just cut a fucking bit of a milk container off. I've wrapped it in my Tottenham Hotspur scarf there for warmth. And while I was testing the fertilizer and different soil types and whatever on those plants out there, I was going to sit inside for the whole month or however long it took and read a book to my plant. And I thought, what book would be funny? And have this copy of Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe. I'll read the blurb on the back here. It says, if we look at the evidence presented to us by the explorers and explain to our children that Aboriginal people did build houses, did build dams, did sow, irrigate and till the land, did alter the course of rivers, did sow their clothes and did construct a system of pan-continental government that generated peace and prosperity, then it is likely we will admire and love our land all the more. So basically this book, which I've heard a bit about recently, it's getting a lot of press and just people are talking about it, is this guy going back through the original records of white settlers in Australia and looking at the things that they said about Aboriginal settlements and culture, and basically arguing, this guy Bruce Pascoe is arguing that our concept of what the Indigenous people were doing in Australia before white settlement is very flawed, and they were actually a lot more advanced, and they should just be, anyway, they're a lot more advanced than we thought. Whatever. It's just, I've been meaning to read it because I feel like I don't know anything about Indigenous people. And so I thought I'll read that to my spinach plant. And the joke will be, I'm trying to determine whether spinach is racist or not. If this one grows well and those ones don't, then the spinach is good and it responds well to maybe a re-examination of the Indigenous people's place in Australian society. And if this one doesn't grow well and those ones do, then maybe the spinach is racist and it's like a right-wing, doesn't think that we need to do anything to change our relationship with the Indigenous people in this country, and that would probably be bad. That would be the joke. Anyway, it's a bit of a reach, isn't it? But I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll make something. So what's happened for the last month is I've been killing some of those plants with too much fertilizer, and I've been reading this book to this spinach plant. The book, as it turns out, amazing. This book is fucking cool, and it has so much to do with what I'm doing here, because the main idea, and I read this book and I actually finished it last night, and straight away I went online and I thought, let me try and find, because there are definitely going to be people online saying that it's a lie, because what Bruce starts off, and I'm going to call him Bruce, first name basis, man, what he starts off saying in the book is that basically every idea that we have about Indigenous culture, for them having been hunter-gatherers and nomadic and moving around. All those ideas are false, and the reason they exist is because it was easier for the white settlers to think of Indigenous people as hunter-gatherers and as nomadic, because if that were the case, then they didn't really have any concept of owning the land. And so when white settlers came in and took the land, they weren't taking it from anyone. They were just coming into possession of this land that wasn't owned by anyone. And Pascoe argues over and over again in the book that if those settlers were forced to kind of confront what they had done and confronted with the fact of like, these people did own the land and we stole it from them, it would just be a lot harder to come to terms with. And we as a society don't want to come to terms with that. So we just continue to perpetuate this idea that they weren't really using the land at all and they were just foraging and running around like cavemen, basically. And he goes back through all of these first-hand accounts from settlers, people like Charles Sturt, famous names. That's the only one I can think of, but there are a bunch of other ones, and he quotes their like journals and logbooks and shows how in the same passage they'll talk about how these Indigenous people had like clay huts that were permanent structures capable of housing 20, 30, 40 people. They had really sophisticated like kind of fish farming structures, and the settlers saw this stuff, and they either thought that the Indigenous people couldn't have made it, and they thought that maybe other Europeans had been there before them, or they thought maybe it was like a naturally occurring thing, or sometimes they even did give them credit from, they were like, oh, it's amazing that they made this thing, and then in the same sentence would be like, this land would be so good for farming cattle and sheep, and none of them really acknowledged that they were stealing the land, because I think central to the whole book is this idea that no one really thinks that they're not doing a good thing. Everyone thinks that they're doing the right thing, and all of these settlers, none of them thought they were doing a bad thing. They all thought, even the ones when they were killing Indigenous people were thinking, oh, well, they're just savages and they're not really using the land, they're aggressive, they're attacking us, they're not good Christians, and they didn't really confront what they were doing, which was massacring the people who lived on this land before us. And if that was all the book was, it'd be just like confronting, but if Bruce Pascoe had written the whole book in just a tone of anger and aggression and like accusation of the current society, I think it would be confronting, but I'd be able to look past it and be like, well, that's just that, you know, that's what happened. Sorry, I guess. But he's not just saying that in the book. It feels like a lot of the criticism online is coming from people who just feel attacked by this book. They just feel like this is a book and a man who's saying to them, you did these things, fuck you. But that's not what I think those people who are kind of coming back at it like that with aggression are missing the whole point of the book, because that's not really what he's saying in the book. I mean, even in that quote on the back when he says, did construct a system of blah, 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 if we took the evidence presented to us by explorers and explained all of this good stuff, it is likely that we will admire and love our land all the more. And what Bruce Pascoe spends a lot of the time explaining in the book is that Indigenous people had a lot of, 40, 50,000 years of a continuous civilization. They had experienced dealing with the land, dealing with the Australian climate, and they had evolved practices and ways of being in Australia, farming, like interconnected relationships with the animals and plants and whatever you want to call it. It sounds fucking wishy-washy and wanky. I feel weird talking about it because I feel like I want to call myself a pussy. They had developed a way of being on this continent, specific to this continent, that allowed them to survive for that long. And when Europeans came in, when we came in and colonized the land, we brought European ways of interacting with land that had developed in Europe with different land and a different climate, and we brought them to Australia. And a big one that he talks about is cattle and hoofed animals that when they walked around on the soil, they compacted it down. So there were these soils that had been built up over thousands of years in Australia to grow the crops that were native to the country, and these crops had been cultivated or evolved or whatever to survive in a climate that was like the Australian climate. There's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of rainfall, but these crops grew in the climate and in the soil. And as soon as white settlers brought in the animals that were from Europe, they fucked all of that soil up in a few generations. It went from being the productive soil that all the Australian flora and fauna evolved evolved in, and these animals kind of changed it into not a European soil, but not an Australian soil either, this kind of in-between thing, and it happened so fast that the plants and the animals didn't have a time to evolve with it, so now we're just stuck with this fucking soil that isn't anything. And there are no plants and animals that are evolved to live in it and thrive in it, so it seems like we have this whole myth of our country as being this barren wasteland. Oh, it's full of desert and it's all fucked. It's so hard and awful to live in, and we just got to tough it out. But that's not how it needs to be at all. Indigenous people lived for 40 or 50,000 years, maybe more, on this continent, and they did fine. They were here. They were doing it because they had developed ways to exist within this climate. And as soon as Europeans came here, we came here and tried to make it into Europe and tried to live in it like it was Europe. And Bruce is basically saying what we as a society need to do now, and it seems so fucking obvious, but what we need to do now is forget about everything that we knew and everything that we brought over from Europe. Well, not even forget it, but like, okay, we've got that, but maybe we need to look back to the people who lived here for 50,000 years and ask them, what were you guys doing? What were you guys doing for 50,000 years that made this place somewhere where you could live and populate the entire continent and have people living here and it sustained life for 50,000 years? How can we learn from that and incorporate that into the society that we have right now? And the added kind of bonus of that mindset would be if we can come to Aboriginal culture and incorporate it into our culture rather than shunning it or trying to breed it out like Australia has done for the last 250 years with the stolen generation and taking kids from their fucking families and trying to educate them as white. All this awful stuff that Australia has done to Indigenous people for 250 years. If we just came to that culture and said, what can you teach us and what can we learn from you? And like gave it the fucking respect that it deserves and incorporated that learning into our current culture. If we did that, then that would give a certain amount of dignity to that culture and maybe give those people a place. Like if we just gave them, but if they had a place in our society, maybe there wouldn't be the fucking problems that there are right now with, you know, Indigenous people. If you've been in Australia, if you've lived in Australia or been to Australia and seen the existence that a lot of Indigenous communities have in our country, it's like they don't have a place and it's horrific. Is it the way I see it? I don't know. I mean, maybe that's not how Indigenous people see it, but it seems like these people are they're like a lost people and a lot of the times it's like they don't have a place and their land and everything has been taken away from them and they're just lost, you know? And the culture that we exist in doesn't feel like it wants to give them a place. It feels like we don't have a place for them either. It feels like they don't have a place in this land and it feels like we don't have a place for them. And maybe going back and looking at the culture and the achievements that culture, the things that they achieved, like existing in this fucking arid continent for 50,000 years, and if we went back and went, what can you teach us? That would be the start of them having a place. I don't know, it was an awesome fucking book to read, and it was almost like a roadmap of like, this is how we can do that. And to see the way that some people have reacted to it online with anger and, I don't know, that was just fucking whatever. I don't even need to talk about those people. But yeah, I read that book. I read it out loud to this plant. I've been doing that for the last month. And it started off as a joke. It started off, I guess I didn't give the book the credit that it deserved when I started reading it. I'd heard about it and I was just like, oh, that'll be fun. That'll be like a good joke to read it to my spinach, you know? I mean, that gives you an idea of how much credit I gave the ideas in this book a month ago. It's like, I'll just read it to my spinach plants as a fun little joke because I'm a backyard bitch. And then I started reading it and listening to the fucking things that old Pascoe was saying, and it's like, it's an incredible book, man. And there's a lot of incredible stuff in there. I'm really glad that I read it, and I want to try, and I mean, I've got such a small garden here, so I don't know that I'm going to be able to incorporate that much of what's in this book into my gardening practices. But what I guess I should try and do now, because I'm part of that culture that is still here and still is saying this country's fucked, the land's fucked, whatever. I've ordered some fucking yam daisy seeds off eBay is what I've done, which I'm sure is what everyone has done, because I've been online and there's everywhere's sold out of these seeds. But I found a place that has them and I've ordered them, and I'm going to plant some in my garden, and I'm just going to see how they grow, because that's one of the main things that Bruce Pascoe says is like one of the big crops, and it keeps coming up in the book. This is one of the crops that Indigenous people use and cultivated across the whole country, and it sustained them. Whatever, I don't fucking know. I've got some yam daisies and I'm going to grow them, alright? I read Dark Emu to my spinach plant, and I think that my spinach plant, you know what? Look at how it's doing there. The leaves aren't looking very good. I think my spinach plant may be racist. Cell number 1 in the potting mix tray. Number 1 is growing well. Number 2 with a bit of fertilizer going well. Number 3, okay, a little bit stunted, maybe too much fertilizer. 4 and 5, dead. With the soil from the garden, number 1 growing well. Number 2 growing well. 3, little bit stunted again. 4 and 5 dead. And the seeds in the soil from the garden, the seed didn't really, one of them did germinate but not really, and in the potting mix a few of them germinated, but the stuff with too heavy fertilizer didn't germinate. I'm genuinely gonna do this. I'm gonna read this whole book to my spinach. This is just what I'm gonna do.